welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I'd like to ask Ambassador Theodore Sedgwick to say some welcoming remarks.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Todd Sedgwick, U.S. Ambassador to Slovakia. We're very happy and proud to sponsor this series of face-to-face events. I think this is one of the best turnouts we've ever had for any face-to-face event. And as I'm sure you will be able to tell by the discussion tonight, the purpose of these events is not to espouse the United States perspective on any issue. The purpose is to have a discussion. And as I say, I'm sure you'll see that tonight. I think it's very timely that we have this discussion on NATO right now. This is the 10th anniversary of Slovakia being invited to apply to NATO. Also, this is right after I want to pay tribute to my friend Káčer for the extraordinary job that the Slovak Atlantic Commission did with the GlobeSec conference. This that was very recent, which really kicked off this great pathway to the NATO summit in Chicago. And this NATO summit in Chicago is very significant for us in the United States because it's only the third NATO summit we've had in the United States in the history of NATO. And it's the only one that's ever taken place outside of Washington, which I think is very important because many Americans don't really have a good understanding of NATO and what NATO is doing, the future of NATO. Many Americans, frankly, if they think of NATO at all, it's maybe in more of a Cold War context. So we really need to have a better education about NATO in my own country. So with that, I'd like to thank Matt Miller of our public affairs staff for putting this together. Thank the great panelists for coming tonight, and they all are uniquely suited to discuss this topic tonight. So I think you'll enjoy it, and I would want to encourage you all to ask some good questions, which I'm sure you will. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Matt Miller, who will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you again to our panelists. I would also like to thank the Open Society Foundation. They're our partner in these monthly face-to-face panel discussions. We try to choose a topic that is timely and thematic and explore that topic to the extent possible. And so we encourage you to come to other events in the future. I'd like to introduce our panelists now. The first panelist on my right is Dr. Eduard Chmelár. Dr. Chmelár is a Slovak historian, political and media analyst, and civic activist. He acts as a theorist and a promoter of alterglobalism and world citizenship. He studied journalism in Bratislava and intercultural relations at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. He was active in both the media and civil society during the Velvet Revolution, and since then he has led many civic campaigns, such as the successful 2001 campaign to abolish compulsory military service in Slovakia and protests against the war in Iraq, as well as a campaign for a referendum on accession to NATO, something I'm sure he'll be speaking about tonight. He is coordinator for the Initiative for Civic Constitution, and currently Dr. Chmelár is head of the Institute of Political Sciences at the Faculty of Mass Media at the Paneuropean University here in Bratislava. In his scientific interest, he is focused on globalization and the media. Next to him, we have Michel, a distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, where he concentrates on transatlantic defense and security issues. Prior to joining INSS in August 2002, Mr. Michel served over 17 years in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where one of his positions was as Director for NATO Policy. His other governmental positions include work at the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence, a stint as a national security legislative aide for a member of Congress, and service in the U.S. Navy. Our next panelist is Róbert Ondrejcsák. He is currently the director for the Center for European and North Atlantic Affairs, a think tank focused on international relations and security policy, where he had previously served as executive director from 2007 to 2010. He has served twice at the Slovak Ministry of Defense. From 2010 to 2011, he was state secretary, and 2003 to 2005, he served as director of Security and Defense Studies Institute. He was also a foreign and security policy advisor to the vice president of the National Council of the Slovak Republic from 2002 to 2003. Mr. Ondrejcsák's areas of expertise include Central Europe, U.S. foreign and security policy, and transatlantic relations. And finally, we have Ambassador Rastislav Káčer, who was elected president of the Slovak Atlantic Commission in July 2008 after completion of his 5-year term in Washington, D.C. as the ambassador of Slovakia to the United States. Prior to this, Ambassador Káčer served at different decision-making levels for 16 years in the Slovak government. He began his career as a policy analyst at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, rising to head of the analytical unit. Between 1994 and 1998, he served at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and on his return from Brussels became head of policy planning staff and the Director General for Security Policy and Multilateral Affairs at the Ministry. In 2001, he became the Secretary of State at the Ministry of Defense, responsible for the negotiation and accession process of Slovakia to NATO. So as you can see from this introduction, all 4 of our panelists are very well qualified to discuss tonight's theme. And so I'll begin with just a little brief introduction and then allow our panelists a moment to give some opening remarks. NATO was founded in 1949 as a political and military alliance in the aftermath of the Second World War. Since then, it has played a crucial and unique role in maintaining stability and security in the transatlantic area, particularly during the Cold War. Today, the alliance comprises 28 North American and European democracies that have joined together to defend their shared values. In 2.5 weeks, in the U.S. city of Chicago, often called President Obama's hometown, the U.S. will host heads of state and government, foreign and defense ministers, and delegations from the 27 other NATO countries and those of the 22 ISAF partner countries, as well as other key contributors. Scheduled for Chicago are discussions on Afghanistan, NATO defense capabilities, and the importance of NATO's global partnerships. But certainly there will be many other issues regarding the future of the alliance. In advance of Chicago, we'd like to discuss the prospects for the summit, what lies beyond for NATO, and how the alliance will or won't transform itself to meet the new challenges of the next century. So with that, I'd like to give each of our panelists a moment to give some brief introductory remarks based on our topic tonight. I'll start with Dr. Chmelár.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, if I can choose, I prefer speak Slovak. It's okay?
Of course.
Firstly, I'd like to thank to the Embassy of the U.S. for the invitation to this panel discussion. I'm not really sure whether I am a suitable candidate for this debate because my positions and standpoints will be, I presume, really different from the other speakers, but not only for that, but once you are opening such a topic in a public discussion in such a clear-cut way, the future of NATO, and then your task is even more difficult. And I'll give you an example. There are rules of a public discourse. If I ask a question whether this is a pure, natural orange juice, and one person says yes, this type of answer may be sufficient to him or her, and nobody needs more evidence for that. But if somebody says that this is not a 100% orange juice, I presume that not only the auditorium, but also he himself or herself needs a little bit of more explanation why he thinks so. So first, I believe that when it comes to NATO, it was really unfortunate, actually the way of its transformation and transition after the Cold War. And NATO, at the beginning of the 90s, had the unique chance after it won in the Cold War to close that war, to finish that war, by symbolically changing its name, which in part of the world it still evokes this time of Cold War, and psychologically part of the world's population cannot get rid of the syndrome of Cold War from the very name NATO. And secondly, the overall structure could have been changed that said, in line with the statement of Zbigniew Brzezinski from 1990, that finally there is a time for United Nations, that it will be transformed in a regional army of UN, that to a military alliance of this type. And the result of this 20-year effort is that the NATO is still searching for its purpose and for justification of its existence, even though the official statements and declarations seem to be clear, and in giving the notion and a message that yes, the existence of NATO is justified. I would be really glad to open this topic. This is not a political discussion. There are no politicians in here, and I believe therefore our debate can be more relaxed, more open. Please, let's try to step out of the box and try to look for deeper meaning. Because when we talk about safety and security, we talk about specific measures how to provide for our safety and security. And once we are talking about summit in Chicago, we should also assess and evaluate the overall mission in Afghanistan and its very purpose and justification. Why it happened. This is not only my opinion, the opinion of some kind of analyst from Bratislava, but some of the British and American generals actually presented this position, that this war is lost. And I am becoming really united with this kind of vocabulary, with those statements. We should be talking about a mission that just failed. And for a couple of years, we are just looking for a way how to back out from this war. This deadline was given for 2014. And the only question that is there ahead of us is how the top politicians will be able to interpret to the public the failure of this action and of this war. Next, when a couple of years ago I was talking in the media that if there is no real reason, NATO or US will never ever leave totally from Afghanistan, from one and only reason, at least. Afghanistan is a strategic area that borders with Russia, China and Iran. And from the perspective of US, and I will say it in such a bold way, the US would be silly if it gave up and surrendered on its space and territory. And the recent visit of Obama and signing the strategic partnership with Afghanistan that allows for the presence of military troops after the official termination of the mission just confirms this. And this type of lingo that is used, I'm sorry for saying that, those of us who have survived through Brezhnev times, through socialistic times, it seemed and it felt like this socialistic Brezhnev type of newspeak about providing for peace to Afghanistan, and that they accepted the invitation of Afghan people to protect them and to protect peace, including the friendly relations with President Karzai, who most of the population of Afghanistan hates. But this didn't prevent them from making him his best ally. So, it seems to me that NATO lacks really honest and open debate and discussion about the ways how safety should, in 21st century, should be defined. The different definition than through military measures. What are the purposes and what is the meaning of accumulating the budgets for defense that actually became a complete dogma in our geospace? Because everybody presumes and expects that the military budgets of most of the NATO countries are just way too low. And I need to say that especially in relation with the Slovak Republic, I do agree, because the budget of our army is so that our army couldn't defend itself. But if we compare the overall expenditures on weapons and on defense, we are forgetting and omitting different data that is produced, for instance, by Stockholm International Institute for the Peace Research. This is a very well-respected and renowned institute that has for various years warned in its annual reports that the current status with investments into defense and into the military budget, it's totally not justifiable. So if we are talking about the need of the NATO member states to participate more in missions and to take over certain responsibilities, to be accountable, we should justify it better. Not by saying only that we have certain commitments. This is not a real justification why we should be doing so. But the efficiency of the money spent should be clearly justified. Otherwise, it is something very similar than as if you were buying drugs, medications, just out of prevention, because you don't know why you are buying them and why you are getting them, but just in case you would once need it. So this intro of mine into this debate is rather motivated about the fact that if we are going to be talking about the requirement to provide for safety of NATO member states, my positions and statements will be about, let's talk in a more accurate, precise and clear way. Let's use a really transparent newspeak. What is standing, let's face what is standing behind all the phrases we are using.
Mr. Michel.
Well, listening to your intervention, it actually reminds me of a story that occurred in Chicago, but in a different context. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey then was running for the Democratic nomination for president, and the convention was held in Chicago. And Hubert Humphrey was known for his long-winded speeches. And the story is that before he got onto the stage to give his speech, his wife, Muriel, took him aside and said, Hubert, just remember, in order to be immortal, your speech doesn't need to be eternal. Well, Mr. Humphrey ignored his wife's advice. He spoke at great length. He lost the audience in the convention hall. He lost the audience on television, and he eventually lost the election. So tonight, one goal of mine is not to repeat Mr. Humphrey's mistake. Having said that, I would like to say that in NATO, one summit tends to build upon another. A lot was done at the last NATO summit in Lisbon in November of 2010, and some of that actually answers some of your concerns, because the alliance really has transformed itself quite a bit since the end of the Cold War. It hasn't transformed its name, but its membership has grown considerably. Its roles and missions have changed. It's in many ways more of a security organization than one that's simply oriented towards collective defense. And of course, the types of risks and challenges that NATO faces are very different today. There's no longer a Soviet Union. This is a good thing. I'm not nostalgic for the Cold War. But I think NATO still has a very important role to play. And I think most Europeans, as most Canadians and Americans, are glad that it's here. Look at its role in Bosnia, where its role helped put an end, at long last, to a war that cost something like 200,000 lives. Look at its role in Kosovo. Look at its role also today, which we can discuss in more detail, in Afghanistan. And even more recently in Libya. The strategic concept that the alliance agreed upon in 2010, however, like all statements, can't entirely anticipate the future. So what's changed since then? It's proved to us that, first of all, we're we're not always very precise or accurate in predicting the future. If you had asked those 28 heads of state and government in November of 2010, would they be engaged 3 months later in a UN-sanctioned intervention, which I think was a good intervention in Libya, they probably would have said, no, you're crazy. We're not going to be involved in Libya. But within 10 days of that UN mandate, NATO was in operation. First to enforce a no-fly zone, and then ultimately to protect civilians, and to support, not to lead, but to support what was essentially a Libyan uprising against a brutal dictator. There's been another change as well that wasn't anticipated. Europe and the United States had already seen signs of a serious financial crisis, but in many ways it got worse after November 2010. And so all of our governments, and here I include the United States, is faced with the fact that its deficit is now today a national security issue. And so our government, like many governments in Europe, is forced to look at its defense structure and say, are we doing the best with the resources that are available? And if we are to reduce, how do we reduce responsibly? At NATO, at the summit in Chicago, and I'll just mention these quickly, I think there will be three big priority items. I think by a great margin, the top priority item has to be Afghanistan. In Lisbon, the alliance, by consensus of all 28 members, agreed that it would support the target of the Afghan president to take over the lead role for security operations in the entire country by the end of 2014. Now, I will be honest with you, there has been mixed results since then. And you don't have to believe me, the President of the United States admits this. The Chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff admits this. It is a mixed picture. On the security front, there are signs of progress. There are parts of southern Afghanistan now where there were daily and very intense combat operations that today the security picture is relatively, and I do say relatively good. There's now going to be increasing emphasis on the situation in eastern Afghanistan. Is it a perfect situation? No. Are there continuing attacks against Afghan citizens for the most part, but also against ISAF in the capital and elsewhere? Yes. Very hard to defend against a small group of determined people who are willing to commit suicide and to blow themselves up and, by the way, blow up Afghan citizens and, whenever they can, a NATO soldier. So the situation is not perfect, but the Afghan forces are improving with difficulty. They are improving over time. And really the alliance recognizes that there's no military solution to Afghanistan. What is at stake at Chicago, and this is filling in, if you will, some of the spaces that were left open at Lisbon, is what will be the nature of the drawdown between now and the end of 2014. How do we work together as an alliance to transition greater responsibility to the Afghan National Security Forces? No one wants to be in Afghanistan militarily forever. And how does one work in the period after 2014 to ensure that there is not a return of the worst elements that we saw of the Taliban, who were very friendly and gave refuge to Al-Qaeda for many years before the 9/11 attacks. You ask, why are we in Afghanistan? I was in the Pentagon in 9/11. For me, it's not a question. There are some other related issues. The question of finances is an important one. The U.S., I'll speak only from an American perspective. I'm not an American policy official anymore, but as someone who is very aware of the debate going on in the United States, we have been at war in Afghanistan and Iraq for about a decade now. Our troops have left Iraq. It's not only to fulfill a campaign promise of the president, it's actually something that the great majority of the American public wanted as well, to draw a close in a responsible way to that chapter in our history. In Afghanistan, the situation is somewhat different. The U.S. and its allies went in there under a UN mandate. We have been there working not only in the military fashion, but with civilian organizations, with our own civilian experts, to try not to build Afghanistan into a new Switzerland, but to restore or help the Afghans restore a minimum level of decency in the society, of protection for women, the ability of children to go to schools, and so forth. No one believes that this is an easy situation, but it does cost resources. So as we draw down, we're looking, how do we use the resources better? We also have other security responsibilities in the world. The United States certainly doesn't seek a military conflict with China, but it's hard to deny that China is a rising regional actor, has raised concerns among some of its neighbors, with whom the United States has security agreements. And while we have important and growing economic ties and even educational and cultural exchanges with China, we also have to balance this with the security presence in the area. This is the so-called rebalance, greater focus on Asia, foreseen by our strategy documents in early January. As we do this, though, the United States is not leaving Europe. We are not leaving Europe, and I believe we are welcome in Europe, or else we wouldn't be here. We are, in some instances, moderately reducing the presence of forces, particularly of two Army brigade combat teams, which, by the way, for most of the past decade were not in Europe anyway, because they were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. But in other areas, the U.S. presence and activities in Europe will actually increase, with the basing of missile defense ships in Spain, a new radar facility for missile defense purposes in Turkey, agreements with Poland, agreements with Romania, and actually soon to begin a more frequent rotation of U.S. troops in Europe to participate in exercises for the NATO response force. Why are we in Europe? Why I think we will stay in Europe or want to stay in Europe? We have NATO commitments for collective defense. We also want to be able to work together with allies and partners in operations outside of Europe where we agree to do so. And the best way to do that is to be here, to train, to understand each other, to learn also from Europeans. This is not a one-way relationship, but it's one that has to be maintained over the years. Finally, there are other questions, and I will simply, in the interest of time, name them for you, and we can discuss in greater detail. There's the issue of missile defense for NATO, something that NATO agreed to do, but this will be a milestone at Chicago because the allies, I believe, are prepared to agree to an initial operating capability for missile defense. They will also discuss the future of partnership, and it's not only the members of Partnership for Peace that are concerned, but there are a number of countries, 3 Arab countries, for example, during the Libyan conflict, that participated with NATO in the operation and want to maintain relations. Afghanistan, you have the Australians who've worked very closely with us. And finally, although it's not on the agenda, we could usefully discuss today or this evening the relationship between NATO and the European Union. Slovakia is a member of both. They are different organizations with different memberships somewhat, some different roles, some different political objectives, but in the community of security and defense affairs, these are 2 organizations that actually do cooperate together and probably will cooperate more in the future. This is something that I think Americans encourage, and for the most part, I think Europeans see this as a positive role as well. So I don't want to violate Muriel Humphrey's rule anymore, and let me pass the microphone to our next interlocutor.
So, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you to organizers for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's a very useful thing a few weeks prior to Chicago summit. And I think it's very important to start a discussion of the future mission and future nature of NATO. We hear some critical voices towards NATO, that NATO needs transformation, NATO needs to define a new mission in the future. But I think it's quite natural process and procedure. Each organization, each alliance which has an ambition to remain relevant in the new circumstances of global security environment and or international relations needs to transform its structures, its operation, its missions. So there is no organization in history which was able to remain as a relevant institution without the capability of transform itself. So I see the Chicago summit, but also the whole discussion which occurs the time being as a very important watershed in this discussion. We are witnessing very important trends, the international relations, the situation when we witnessed huge operations, almost enduring operations like Iraq or Afghanistan. So these times are over because of the political feelings, political situation in the Euro-Atlantic space. As the most exclusive interpretation, you can find the current American security strategy, or security guidelines, or something like that. So, and NATO also has to adapt to the current approaches of the most important members. So, I think NATO needs very important, or needs answers for three very important questions, or three very important questions. First, the nature of future partnerships. As has been already mentioned, for example, Australia or other Pacific states are one of the most important non-member contributors to Afghanistan mission, or Georgia. So these states are very important partners in Afghanistan now, but how we define their place in the future, NATO Australia, NATO Japan, or NATO Georgia context, when we'll terminate the operation in Afghanistan, how we will redefine the whole nature and whole approach towards these partners. The second very important thing is the future of NATO's operations. What kind of operations the NATO will realize, and which reason or regions, and which are the timelines for these operations. So, as I already mentioned, probably we will not witness year-long or a decade-long operations in the future. So, if not that kind of operations, so which kind of operations NATO will launch in the future? And the third operation is the enduring question of relationship between focus on operations abroad or expedition operations, and the so-called Article 5 missions and Article 5 approach. I think it's very important not only for Central European countries, but also for other countries like Norway, but also other European countries. So these three questions has very important implications also for member state strategies and member states' armed forces, structures of armed forces, missions of armed forces, but also modernization programs of armed forces. So without relevant answers to these questions, we are not able to work on future strategies and long-term planning of our armed forces. So is the reason why I would consider Chicago summit and the whole discussion around that as a very important for also for the member states' future, for the future of security strategies, but also foreign policies. The next challenge is that we are witnessing that the whole generation of American politicians, but not only politicians, but high-ranking officials which have very close relations with Europe and European allies, are going to pension. So 2 decades ago, the United States has more than 300,000 troops in Europe, and these troops and soldiers and officers have day-by-day contacts with Europe's European allies. The situation is quite different, and we are losing this capability of having these psychological relations between the United States and European countries. So it's a challenge for both sides, also for the Americans and for European countries. So how to react on change, generational and change in American politics and military thinking, but also in American society. So I think it's quite natural that the focus of American politics and strategy is slightly turning towards the Pacific space and Pacific regions. If we are looking for analyzing the changes of global security environment and international relations, economics and other things which are closely interlinked, I think it's quite a natural process, but it's also a challenge for Europeans how to react on these issues. So is the second issue which has to be discussed in Europe. You already mentioned the question of defense budget or defense budgets in Europe. I think from that point of view, the Chicago summit has one very important project, the so-called AGS, Allied Ground Surveillance System, which is the only common capability which is currently planned in NATO and which has a strategic character and which has some financial background, which has some logistical background already on place. So it has also symbolic message. By the way, Slovakia is one of the 13 participating countries on that project. So I think it's one of the possible answers how to react on post-Afghanistan development on NATO. Of course, there are some tendencies and discussions where the so-called smart defense is discussed as a medicine for everything. So, but I think it's quite dangerous myth, because in some discussions the smart defense and the level of European Union, the pooling and sharing, is taken as an alternative towards appropriate level of defense spending. I think we have to work with that myth, and we have to analyze and we have to discuss it, that it's not true. The opposite is the true. If we would like to participate on the so-called multinational project, we have to invest on defense. And in various cases, it's not the way how to build up new capabilities. In various cases, it's a way how to keep some key capabilities, core capabilities for NATO. If you are checking the defense inflation, it's around 10%, maybe more by year, and it's true that from 2 or 3 decades from now, the majority of European countries will not able to keep the so-called key capabilities independently. So I think it's one of the biggest challenges prior to Chicago, how the summit will be able to answer these questions. And I'm really looking forward to the final decision on AGS. Everybody knows that there is a principal decision about launching the AGS, but there is a Spanish opt-out or something like that, or additional approval. So it's a really key and symbolical question for NATO's future and NATO's so-called common capabilities. So just very briefly, the most important challenges from my point of view, which NATO, which is discussed according to NATO's future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh my God. I'm overwhelmed. Thank the organizers for inviting me and having the opportunity to say a couple of comments. Every time I say I'll speak, I'll be short, I'll speak for long, so I say nothing, and hopefully this will make me speak short. On NATO in general. NATO was a concept which was created in late 40s as a lesson taken of the first half of the 20th century. And this was a successful lesson taken, and it was a success for the last 60 years. There is no question. And NATO is not a God's creation. God's creation, they tend to be here for long. NATO is an on-purpose created human concept to help make the alliance of nations secure. And it made the alliance secure. It won the Cold War. And it's still here to be the cornerstone and the basic pillar of our security. We have nothing better so far. We may have and one day we will have, or maybe won't have, in the history we saw many times a great project of civilizations being successful for decades, centuries, and eventually they lost, and they were not create something which was able to transform and keep to be competitive in the overall global competition. NATO was a concept which has been competitive and good concept for the last 60 years. But I'm not saying it will be here forever. May not be. To the second point, maybe the original purpose of NATO was very briefly and funnily explained by Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General: Americans in, Russians out, Germans down. And this was a good description of NATO in the early 50s. As a sign of transformation, as a matter of curiosity, Russians are not to be kept out. We welcome them, we call them, we want them to be part of the thing, more than they are able to. Actually, I think how many leaders were calling new President Putin to come to Chicago? He says he doesn't want to. It's his choice. So Russians are not kept out. Russians are called in more than they are able to. Second, Germany down. Everybody comes to Germany today and say, you have low ambitions. You should raise your ambitions. You should lead more and you should be much bolder. So, funny thing, nobody wants to keep Germany down. Rather, everybody comes encouraging Germany to stand up and play a much more distinctive role in European and global security. On Americans in, this is a little bit of something where I have hesitations how to describe that, because we want them in. But some say that they are going out, that the pivot is out. I don't agree with this. I think it is boldly and hugely exaggerated. And I don't like this discussion on horse trading issue, that who contributes more and who contributes less. NATO was never, ever a concept of horse traders. NATO was always quite a noble concept in an old-fashioned way, one for all for one, and is applied since the history of NATO, and was always applied. And I don't think that NATO will be transformed one day into a horse trading business. On the pivot issue, we have to admit that, that not only NATO was able to change in 60 years, but the whole world changed. There is, first of all, no Cold War. There is no bipolar division of the world. There is a kind of a strange multipolar arrangement, which we don't know how this will play out at the end. When we spoke of new partnership, we see that NATO used to be the core of nations who fought together, but now we have a variable symmetry of various cooperations on military operations and civilian operations and intelligence sharing. Out of this inner core of NATO, we go out and share things and cooperate in much more flexible formats than we used before. And even the world changed. If we have defense budgets falling down in Europe, it's often not only the thing that elites are not willing to give money for defense, it's also the issue that defense is not able to cope with current challenges, because how you cope with the thing that we don't need Americans physically postured in Europe, because, you know, colonel can sit down in Nevada bunker with a joystick, having nice coffee in the morning with his wife, then changing to his military camouflage and go down and fight with UAV over Pakistan, and they'll in the evening enjoy a nice steak back in his home in Nevada. You know, worlds change substantially, psychologically, in the division of labor, technologically, and the nature of challenges and everything. Where I see challenge for NATO is to be able to keep up the speed of those changes. And sometimes I think that we grow with a generation of politicians who are losing a little bit of sense for strategic thinking, who kind of in a Western civilization, in Western democracies, think that all the things which came through its evolution of liberal democracies are granted, will be here forever, and we don't need to do nothing anymore for that, which is not truth. Again, in the retrospective in history, this happened many times, and many times humanity was wrong and paid terrible price. So I don't know whether we will be right or wrong, but what I expect of NATO is to keep up the speed of changes which are coming and which we face. Now, for NATO summit, and this will be the end of my introduction, I have low expectations for Chicago. I don't think there is any major big agenda to be taken. This is just before the presidential elections in the United States. I don't know. I'll need to have a bet, a crystal ball, to bet whether Obama is going to be re-elected or not. But we will see some kind of a new administration to come. There is no major agenda. Afghanistan is here. I'm a little critical about the operation in Afghanistan in principle, and I might come to that if the audience will be interested what I mean when I say that. First of all, I mean that but we should set the goals, military goals, which have a precise, defined ends. So we don't speak of being defeated or losing the war. I don't agree, you know, because this is the point of view how you define whether you win. And if you make a wrong definition of your goal, then it's easy to say that you lost, and we should not pay that stupid price and get caught in our own mistakes of definitions at the end. So there will be something on Afghanistan. What I think is extremely important for Chicago is really acknowledge new variable symmetry of partnerships. This is a new trend, and there has to be something where we will be clear, because new partnerships are welcomed, but there are some limits to those partnerships. And those limits to those partnerships are like in other relationships, in human relationships. There are some kinds of levels of human relationship where you have to buy in all terms. So if there is a country which would be an EU country, not NATO country, say, well, we want to have more decision-making because we are a good partner for NATO. And my response to that, it's appreciated, it's valued, but there are certain limits. If you want to go beyond those limits, why don't you join? It's very simple. Why not to go in? Why you are so, you know, kind of want to take the profit, and I say, no, this is a military alliance, I don't want to take all of that. But then you come and say, but I'm a good partner, I participate in everything, and I want to have a full, so join. It's simple like that. So we have to acknowledge, we have to admit that it's important to have a more decision-making role in the operations for those who participate in those. But at the end, we have to be honest that there are some core functions of the alliance where you cannot get to if you are not a member, full stop. Part of this partnership is also an issue of those who still aspire. I give an example of Montenegro, which down at Balkans was doing a tremendous job in its transformation of security defense, and they have done a great deal and come very close. By my judgment, they qualify even today, but they are kept on the waiting line for some other reasons, and I think this needs to be acknowledged, because for governments like that, there needs to be the inspiration and the light at the end of tunnel to help to sustain the reforms. The last thing, and the last word is on smart defense. I think this is not only a question of pooling and sharing, and I have nothing to add what Robert was saying. This should not be a pretext for stripping down even more the budget and saying, okay, so you can do it smarter, so we'll take more money from you. As would be my reaction as a Minister of Finance to be, you know, I say, okay, so you can do it, you can pool and share, okay, 10% less. That would be a bad mistake. But not only that, but also producing capabilities which are smart. And Ambassador, you went to Kotor, and this is the last word. You saw those ramparts around the old town. And Kotor was a strategic place once in a day because this was easy to protect. The Navy in there, and they put the little walls around, and they put gunmen on the walls, and this was enough. Today, it's a decaying place because it's not relevant. So the last thing I would want from NATO is to be kind of Kotor of those days, where we would have producing more and more capabilities which will have no relevance and will be decaying reminiscence of our irrelevance. So the great challenge is to stay relevant because you have relevant capabilities, relevant goals, and relevant memberships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, from these opening statements, we see that there are a vast number of issues that we could get into. We're clearly not going to have time for that tonight, but I would like to delve into the major issue that's probably going to be at hand in Chicago, and that's Afghanistan. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to limit us to 15 minutes so we can reach other issues and still have time for questions. But let's go into Afghanistan. We know we have a run-up to 2014, and then what's going to happen after that. Certainly, the bilateral agreement between Presidents Karzai and Obama yesterday may play some role into this, so I want to get your thoughts on these issues. Who would like to speak first?
So, firstly, because I have this position of an devil's advocate, if I'm to talk about Afghanistan and Chicago, I'd like to, after this great introductory round, I'd like to clarify my position on what is safety. For me, safety has two dimensions. First, that I keep on repeating, be it to my students or media, is that the safety is either global or it's non-existent. That means that there is no safety of NATO states in an unstable world. Likewise, as there is no safety of some other state without this context. And this is the baseline for my perspective and position on the roles of the Western democracies and states on the situation. I don't think that the war in Afghanistan made the U.S. a safer place. What has made the U.S. a safer place is a great and excellent role of the secret services rather than its army. And the same is valid for other parts of the society or other member states of NATO. What I see as the biggest danger is not Afghanistan itself or Iran, but it's dissemination of weapons of mass destruction, but not into the hands of individual states. But what I'm really afraid of is not a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran, even though that in this case I don't doubt that Iran is trying to produce a nuclear weapon, but I do not believe that it wants to produce it from aggressive motivation. It strives to produce such a weapon because Tehran has understood that when prior US President Bush created this acts of evil, and then Northern Korea launched its nuclear program that led to the production of a nuclear weapon, Tehran understood that once you have nuclear weapon, you are not a state that is going to be attacked. So they want to produce this nuclear weapon in order to strengthen their position. I don't think that we should be afraid of Iran. We should be rather afraid of the following. If the nuclear weapons get into the hands of terrorists, and very little is being done in this issue. So priorities of NATO policy is set really bad. The second question, and second perspective of mine on safety, and I'm not going to talk from the nationalistic point of view because those of you who know me know that this is something I'm far away from. But I'm going to say this from the position as a member state of NATO. The natural interest of each member state of NATO is to have efficiently guaranteed own safety. And those questions are out of question, and usually they are just commented by the following: NATO protects us because we together, we united, we are strong, and if something happens to us, NATO is going to come up and help us. I don't have time for some analysis, and this is not a question of Slovakia only, but the Article 5 of Washington Agreement is very misinterpreted. According to the lay public, the Article 5 says that if we are attacked by an enemy, other states are obliged to come up and help it out through military force. But this is not true, and the key to this article should be connected to the very establishment of NATO. In April 1949, US refused the original wording of Article 5 that time was saying that in case a member state is attacked, the other member states are obliged to come up and help the attacked state through military measures. Because the US is not going to let somebody some international organization dictate that the US should come and help, but based on this constitution they won't do it, then this Article 5 was transformed into the point that the member states are obliged to come up to assist the attack state with using any measures they consider to be appropriate. And this is an incredible difference, because the Congress, the US Congress in '99, when they were adopting and accepting Czechs and Hungarians and Polish to NATO, they had the law assessment, the internationally renowned experts. They made this. They had this analysis produced where the U.S. is obliged to come up to assist those new states in case they are attacked. The legal statement and position assessment was such that no, they are not obliged, because by measures considered to be appropriate are strong statements or verbal threats, for instance. So from the perspective of a person who is at the same time a historian and who has certain historical memory and remembers that we, back in 30s of last century, we had treaties with Britain and France that were very strong treaties, because it was explicitly said in those treaties that those states are obliged to assist us in military way. And we all know how Munich ended up. And it's not that I would suspect that the US would don't care about us, and I'm not making any positions on that. But if there is a question whether US would to risk a conflict with Russia or some other superpower that would attack Slovakia, I don't believe that Slovakia would be protected under those conditions. So, Hungary alliance is not going to get involved into a conflict of two member states, as we can see it on the case of Greece and Turkey. So the guarantees of safety in such an environment are not given as they are interpreted to the public. The second thing I'd like to emphasize is that the safety in the 21st century expects different challenges than military challenges. I have mentioned already the example of non-dissemination of nuclear weapons, but I also mean something completely different. I'm talking, for instance, about environmental safety, information safety, things that are discussed on intellectual level, but those elements and aspects are underestimated, and everybody focuses on the fact that NATO is a military organization, which preconditions totally different perspective of us sitting here on the world, because you can look at the world through the lenses of trying to stabilize the world by means and measures the world actually needs, or that without any kind of justification you will be repeating that it is primarily most important to strengthen your military presence somewhere, to increase your military budget, to be present in military missions that are otherwise not justified from the perspective of security, because what is Afghanistan or other missions for the safety of NATO? It's really a question on which the security of NATO alliance depends on. If NATO is not to become the world policeman, or that means to take over the role of a grantor of global security and safety, and then it wouldn't be an organization of collective defense, but it will be rather an organization of collective security. All the questions we are debating have shrunk down to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a question of victory, it's a question of prestige. So if I'm talking about security, I also care, with the perspective of the summit in Chicago, to resolve security issues in the context of real problems and challenges of this world in connection to the current crisis, global crisis, and not that it is done in a totally different way, that through military expenditure something is justified, something totally different, because I think this is that end.
Okay, would anybody like to pick up on these thoughts or maybe raise some Afghanistan issues?
I'd like to bring the subject actually back to, to Afghanistan. As I indicated before, I think the reason for U.S. and frankly for European and Canadian involvement there is pretty clear. It's useful to add one or two facts to this discussion. NATO actually had no role, formal role in Afghanistan until the summer of 2003. The original ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, was in a way a coalition of the willing, established and volunteered by European allies, plus Canada, in early 2002. And it was done so under a UN mandate that followed the Bonn Conference, which took place in late 2001. NATO became involved in Afghanistan, actually at the request of European allies, who were having some trouble assuring the continued command and control of their ISAF operation, which at the time was really just limited to Kabul and the region. The United States, I will point out at that time, was not a very large contributor, whereas at one point in that time frame, the NATO operation had a few thousand troops in Kabul. The United States contributed maybe a couple of hundred troops to the ISAF mission, and most of our forces were engaged in what was then Operation Enduring Freedom, where we had several thousand. It was not really until 2006, following a NATO decision by consensus by all of the allies, once again under a UN mandate, to gradually expand the writ of NATO's involvement in a counterclockwise fashion, beginning in the north, which is where German units were. So this was really done at the instigation of the German government at the time. And eventually, in a counterclockwise fashion, NATO took command of the region of the north, west, and then moved into the more dangerous areas of the south and east. At which time, basically in late 2006, the United States transferred what soon became the bulk of its forces from Operation Enduring Freedom to the NATO mission ISAF. And that's how NATO came to be responsible, if you will, for the territory. Now, one can question various tactics, various decisions along the way. One can have an honest debate, which has been, I would point out, a very open debate in the United States that's engaged the Secretary of Defense, that's engaged the military leadership, and who have said quite publicly that because of the Iraq War, there were a great number of American resources, both personnel, intelligence, and other resources dedicated to Iraq, and Afghanistan became what we call an economy of force operation, which was a polite way of saying it was a second priority. And it didn't become a first priority again until several years later. And I think one needs to give the Obama administration credit for reshifting the priorities, and as I mentioned before, the responsible withdrawal from Iraq and more emphasis on Afghanistan. The emphasis has clearly been, and it's stated publicly, this is not a mystery, this is not about Afghan resources, this is not about geographical or geopolitical presence. It's about ensuring that Al-Qaeda, which is a threat not only to the United States, but also has been to Europe and to our interests worldwide, does not have a base to again launch operations that would affect our common security. The world changed after 9/11, and not just in the United States. It changed in terms of your day-to-day security when you go to an airport. It affects trade. It affects the way people live their life. It affects, obviously, even the protection that we have for embassies around the world. We don't want to see this type of attack proliferated in the future. In order to do this, you need a measure of stability in what is admittedly a very difficult region of the world. And these are not hidden problems. The problem of corruption in Afghanistan is not hidden. The problem that you have a very, very fractured state in Pakistan, which is a nuclear-armed state, is not hidden. And these are not responsibilities, and these are not problems that one can simply wish away and turn away and say, well, if we don't have global security, we can't act here or we can't act there. I've heard this phrase before, that security is indivisible, but what does that mean? Does it mean that because the world is not perfect, you can't take any step anywhere to try to protect your security and to try to improve the conditions of security around the world? I don't think so. As I said before, this road ahead is going to be difficult in Afghanistan. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that we've made sufficient success over recent years, that we have a strategy in place. It's a reasonable one, that the goal of turning over responsibility gradually to the Afghans is not impossible. Once again, it won't be a perfect situation, but this requires a shared commitment, and frankly, it requires some shared sacrifice. I will also say that as an American, it is true that some Americans, not all, undervalue the contributions that other allies have made in Afghanistan. Like every country, we tend to mourn our own dead and wounded perhaps more than others. But you should know that there are several allies who have lost more troops per capita in Afghanistan than the United States. This doesn't mean that American lives, to me, and American are any less valuable. But let's not underestimate the contribution done or made by Canadians, by Danes, by British, by Estonians, by Dutch.
On Afghanistan, I'll say more than I wanted initially, and because it fits to the question. I have the view which many people at NATO would not agree. But I would stick to original purpose of NATO, and its defense. Why NATO went to Afghanistan was because it was an attack on the United States, which resulted in around 4,000 victims and substantial material damage. This was not done by a country. This was done by a terrorist group. But the terrorist group has got a safe harbor and official support of a country and the government. My response would be a defensive response. I mean, I'll take care militarily of the training bases, infrastructure, everything which would be related to military organization of the terrorist group, and I would very seriously talk to the government and say, I am not going, as the alliance, I'm not going to tolerate this kind of support for terrorist branch. So put it in a more blunt, simple words. I say, you come and hit me in my face, I'll come and I hit you back, so you don't think that you can do this to me again. And if you will not take your own lesson, I will come and I'll do you much more damage that you have done to me. So the response is credible and the deterrence is credible. This is the defense. And I'll come to a couple of words with Mr. Chmelár very creatively explained about his view of security. That there is no security if there is no global security. I don't believe in that, and it's been never true in human history. Every country is here to take care of its own security. That's the basic purpose, why we have states, why we have governments, and why we have countries. So for Slovakia, it's 5 million nation, and I want my government to be able to take care of Slovakia's security as much as possible, and I'm extremely selfish on that, because this is the ultimate prize, and this is the ultimate goal, the security of the country, territorial integrity, peace, safety, guarantee of our way of life, and our choice. For that, because we are small, we create alliances and we find friends, we create relationships. And I want to come to the point of Article 5. Of course the Article 5, it's not enforceable. Nothing in international relations, it's enforceable. Because there is no enforcer. This is not a domestic law. In the country, when you break a written legal arrangement, then there is a police and there is the court, which will bring, hopefully, in less or more working society, it will bring some justice to you. Internationally, if somebody will say in a critical point that I don't care about Article 5, of course there is no way how to enforce that. So even to ask the question for the legal view, it's completely stupid and irrelevant question. Of course there is no way how to enforce Article 5. But I give you an example. This works like in another human relationships. When I was in the church 26 years ago with my wife, I promised under the God and the witnesses that I will love her and cherish and respect and be faithful forever and ever. And I'll do my best doing that, and I was able to do that for 26 years. It's not enforceable. I've done that promise and she did it, but if I broke that, so what, you know? It will be morally wrong. Some people will say he's a jerk, he's a bad guy, it should not happen. But what? Of course, but it works, and you work that relationship. And NATO works when we work that relationship. When there is the trust, when we invest in the relationship, then it works. If we will start, yeah, sure, it will not work. You know, if I was coming to the church 26 years ago and saying somewhere in the back of my mind, sure, I'll be faithful and here, you know, forever and ever, forget about that, and I know that you are not going to do that, you know, in 2 years that will happen. So it's just how much you invest in the relationship, that much you can expect from the relationship. That's all done. It's nothing else. Only nuclear arms. I completely agree, actually, with you. That I even don't care whether Iranian government will have nuclear arms from the point of view of our security as a state-to-state or NATO versus Iran confrontation, because Iranian government, should they wish to use 1 or 2 missiles they will produce for a great cost, it would be a suicidal mission, because once they will fire from their own installation a single nuclear warhead, the second day Iran will cease to exist forever. This is a simple equation. So they are not going to do that because they are not that stupid. What I'm afraid is actually that Iran is an unstable, undemocratic regime, and once they will acquire the knowledge and know-how in a single nuclear warhead, then there is the risk that it will fall one day, sooner or later, in the hands which are not appropriate. And it's a kind of a footnote, which is not a footnote, I just make it a footnote. There is a regime which says, there is the country which I want to erase from the map of the world. And this, I don't think it should be acceptable and tolerable if we would speak of global security as such. I will have many things to say, but I don't think it's important to do so.
All right, well, returning to one of the other NATO themes, and one that we've brought up briefly this evening, the partnerships that are to be strengthened. Robert, you had touched on this briefly. Who are some of these partner countries, and what are our goals in strengthening these relationships with them?
You mean NATO's partners? Okay. I think it's impossible to create one simple and homogeneous group of partners of NATO. So I think each partner is unique from point of view of nature of relationships. So the NATO has a totally different partnership with Russia than with Australia, for example. And from Russian and Australian partnership, the NATO's importance and the NATO's role in their foreign policy and security policy is totally different. So I think it should be a mistake to have one block of partnerships. And it's very difficult to make a hierarchy of partnerships from the point of view of importance and something like that. So currently, if we are looking on Afghanistan, for example, Russia is a crucial partnership because of logistic routes, because of supplies. Australia is a very important partner because of fighting troops. But I really can't imagine, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know what kind of operations the NATO will launch in the future. And I think we have to adapt a flexible approach towards defining of the role of different partners. But behind that, we have to have and we have to establish partnership with as much nations and as much countries as we can. So I think it's absolutely crucial to have a good relationships and partnership with Russians, for example. Of course, it doesn't means that Russia has to have a voice for each and every decision on NATO. It's necessary to define the so-called red lines, for example, on NATO, possible NATO enlargement or other issues, which has to be in NATO's responsibility and NATO's countries' decisions only. So, for example, Georgia is a big question. Georgia has very strong ambitions towards NATO, towards NATO's membership. We know that there are several groups within NATO according to Georgian membership. The Balkan countries are representing a totally different group from that point of view. So Mr. Káčer already mentioned Montenegro, which is a quite interesting future partner for NATO, quite motivating future motivated future partner and potential member. So from that point of view, we can divide these partners into several groups. So some partners doesn't have ambitions to be a NATO member. So I don't know, Russia or Australia because of natural reasons, but there are some countries with that kind of ambition. Georgia, Montenegro, Macedonia, which is a quite unique story, everybody knows. So it's a very unique story. Macedonia has almost clear decision from NATO's point of view on membership, but because of bilateral issues with Greece on firearm Republic of Macedonia and these issues, it's a problematic thing. Serbia, it's a big question mark. So the Serbian parliament already adopted a resolution or something like that. I don't know the exact nature of legal, so the legal things, but it's something like a resolution on neutrality. But so nobody knows the future of Serbian foreign policy. So there are countries like Sweden or Austria or Finland, which countries significantly contributed, mainly Sweden, into NATO's operation on Libya, for example. There is a question on their bonds with NATO. So there is a huge question marks on future relations with Japan and South Korea. So currently, Japan is a very important partner in Afghanistan, but what we would like to have, what kind of partnership we would like to have with Japan or South Korea after 2014. According to the future approach towards Afghanistan, towards investment to Afghani security forces, Japan will become even stronger partners, for example, non-military partners in Afghanistan. So it's a very variable geometry or something like that. Thank you.
Before we open up for questions, I do want to touch on the last theme that will be at the NATO summit in Chicago, and that's defense capabilities. So would someone like to touch briefly on this before we open up for questions?
Wait.
If you'd like to.
I pass the floor.
Well, if you look at the recent operation in Libya, there are some plus sides and there are some worrisome sides about it. On the plus side, you saw a much more active, I would say, European role. And it was not only the British and the French, I give them due credit, but also there was significant participation by several other countries in the strike missions, and a number of countries contributing in important ways to the logistical and other support for the operation. So while the U.S., despite some of the rhetoric that was tossed about by some commentators, the U.S. also provided very, very active support, not only initially in the combat missions or combat strikes, but throughout the operation in terms of very, very critical capabilities like aerial refueling, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, some special capabilities that we have in unmanned aerial vehicles and so forth. But that European role, that I would say their more active political and military participation, I would say the greater partnership or shared leadership, if you will, was a good sign. On the other hand, it did bring to the surface what many of us knew anyway, but it made it much more dramatic, and that is their heavy reliance on the United States capabilities to launch a military mission against what was really a third-rate military power. And this heavy European dependence on some of these critical capabilities is worrisome at a time where the United States has responsibilities, is trying to reduce its force structure, and as I mentioned before, some of the budget considerations. In the end, and I don't want to be the ugly American here and talk only about defense spending. Defense spending is one indicator, not the only indicator of defense of defense effort. But if you put yourself in the position of an American Secretary of Defense, or you put yourself in the position of an American congressman, and you're briefed that here, 20 years after the end of the Cold War, at a time when maybe 20 years ago, the United States was spending as a percentage of NATO's entire, or the defense budget of all of the NATO allies, we were spending about 50% of that. Today, we're now spending about, the United States is responsible for about 75% of total military spending by the NATO alliance. You can argue, many would agree with you, that the United States has spent too much on defense and now has to reduce. We are actually undertaking over the next 10 years very significant reductions. But still the United States is spending today at about somewhere between 4.5, 4.7% of its gross domestic product. That's my product as a taxpayer, the product of my fellow Americans for defense. In Europe, the average is 1.5 or so, and it's dropping fast. So if you're an American Secretary of Defense, if you're an American congressman, if you're an American taxpayer, you might ask yourself the question, in this alliance, where we say, and you're correct, Ambassador, that we have a basic ethos of one for all for one, is this disproportionate effort in defense, is it worrisome? And I think it is. As I said, it's not the only indicator, but it's one worrisome thing. We have these efforts. NATO calls it smart defense. You rightly called attention, Robert, to the fact that the EU has a slightly different pooling and sharing, slightly different approach. These are actually, in the end, quite compatible, but they do run into two problems. One is this issue of sovereignty. You're right, Ambassador, nations do things in their national interest. And there are some nations, and in some cases, I would include the United States, who would say, I want to be careful that if I put my investment into common capabilities, that if there's a crisis, I can use those capabilities, and I won't be blocked because one member of the alliance doesn't agree. And that's an issue of sovereignty. Those issues are valid for some of the smaller countries as well as for some of the larger countries. And there's a very practical issue. Smart defense, once again, I think as you mentioned, is not necessarily defense on the cheap. sometimes you need to invest, at least in the short term, to reap longer term savings. This isn't rocket science. We do this in our daily budgets. This is true for defense budgets as well. And that is an issue. When we have countries that have a defense budget that's flat or being reduced, or in some cases where they have limited defense industries that they would like to protect, so they don't want to see jobs and contracts go elsewhere, it leads to a certain resistance on aspects of smart defense. This doesn't mean that the issue is hopeless. Actually, we do have some good examples. In NATO, we have things like the airborne warning and control system that works. Nations participate, they pay in together, they use it. We have some combined efforts that are outside of NATO for strategic airlift, where a group of countries, including the United States, but a number of allies and some partners as well, the Swedes and the Finns come to mind, have shared access to a pool of C-17s and potentially other air transports in the future, so that systems that some countries can't afford to buy alone, they can share, they can buy airtime, and by the way, they can use them for NATO, they can use them for the EU, if it's an EU mission, they can use them for a UN mission. This is very good flexibility, and it doesn't get so much into the issue of sovereignty. So there are a number of different approaches. There are creative approaches out there. There's no single magic bullet that's going to be the magic solution to smart defense. Bad news in all of this is that it does require some investment, and it requires some difficult decisions by national leaders to say, defense, security is important, and it's not only important to defend ourselves. It's also important to count in shaping the world environment. You are affected by the security environment around you. Whether you want to be or not, you will be affected. So I think it's in your interest to have a voice at the table where people listen to you and say, yes, the country is making an investment, it's serious about defense, it's serious about security, and it's serious about participating in an alliance.
I'd just like to briefly react on some things that have been just said. Firstly, I believe it was Mr. Michel who said that the world is not perfect, but something needs to be done if there are problems. Yes, but not anything. And in case of Afghanistan, you all know far too well that for a couple of years there have been discussions about bad targeting. That basically, if I'm to speak really boldly, the attacks should have been led against Pakistan rather than Afghanistan. And then there was a myth created that I've mentioned at the beginning, and that was the fact that Western civilizations have been paralyzed by the ability of terrorist attacks is the result of war in Afghanistan. This is a result of bravery of secret services in combination with war measures, with the military actions taken. But this is not a question of the very war in Afghanistan. And when Mr. Káčer said that he doesn't believe in global security because this has never worked in the history, but never in the world's history the world was so connected as today. But when we mention history, we need to say that the situation, and why I consider it to be a very dangerous one, and the policy of alliance to be lacking concept, a strategy, lacking a vision, we have been in this situation. Quite popularly, this situation, the current global crisis, is compared with the crisis in the 30s of last century, but I believe that the current situation far more resembles the situation before the First World War. There are a couple of similarities. there was the end or failure of the previous attempt for globalization that took from the last quarter of 19th century to the beginning of 20th century. Second, the states were very nervously increasing their military, their defense. Russia was not able to keep up the pace with the defense efforts of other countries, and Russia was asking Germany and Italy to help us out. And by that time, instability of the world led to the First World War. And I really believe, and I'm really afraid that today we are in the situation, in the stage when sooner or later a big military conflict is going to be inevitable, because we are talking about Afghanistan. We're talking about new concepts, new challenges for wars that have been led by the Western allies or US in the recent decades. There was one thing always valid. Those wars were successful if the concept and goal was clear. Currently, the Western civilization seems to lack the ability to forecast. We think that Afghanistan is an enemy, or to simplify it, we can win the war, but we cannot win the peace. And in all the conflicts that have happened from the end of the Cold War, what actually happened was that the situation never got better at the end. There was no increased amount of stabilization. Talking either about a very fragile Kosovo, Libya, where the antagonisms among tribes have boosted. This is valid for Afghanistan, Iraq. This is valid for all the military attacks, with the only exception of the first Gulf War, where there was one clear goal, the liberation of Kuwait, that was approved by the UN. What is missing here, dear colleague, is, and I know that you are a lawyer, and I'm not to be looking down at the lawyers, but I am clear about the difference between national and international law. But national and international levels need to have certain rules, and those rules, not in the sense of a strict setting as in the national context, but in international context, as of 1999, those rules are not valid, and they are being constantly challenged, and the NATO has entered into a stage that is quite characteristic by various ambiguities. A, ambiguity of the situation in which it can intervene, in ambiguity or unclarity when it comes to the territory where it can intervene, and by unclarity when it comes to the type of weapons that can be used. And this is very dangerous for the alliance as such, not for the outside world. And this is why I'm so skeptical about the fact that the NATO can eventually find such a module that would be finally generally accepted by the partners of the alliance, because NATO, as I have said, doesn't have ambition to take over the role of the world policeman or to substitute for UN. And it's opting for then it is choosing interventions in a very purposeful way, and sometimes not corresponding to the level and the degree of threat they could potentially represent.
Briefly on just a few words on Libya. There's no good news and bad news. Bad news are really the striking lack of critical capabilities in terms of modern requirements of new military technology. That is true on the side of Europeans. It's striking for me as a Slovak. And again, you know, I'm not a theoretical guy. I work for government. I'm not a scientist. I do not sit. I haven't done, you know, 16 years discussing in cafe what should be a global ideal settings. What I was responsible for this country, in a sense that you know, here is the Rhodos, here you jump. This is not what you would wish to be there. This is not something what you would dream of. This is something what you have to do tomorrow, in a week, in 2 weeks, in a month, in a year. What would be an ideal solution and one day, I don't know, you know, maybe I have views, I do, which may be very close to what Mr. Chmelár is saying, but I work for government, and in government you have to make decisions, and often very fast, and decisions which you hate to make. But you have to do them. That's it. And what strikes me even more on the lack of capabilities is that if Slovakia went into the war, like was that high-tech war over Libya, in about 1 week we would kill all of our defense budget, and in about 1 week we would shoot all of our smart ammunition, and it'll be done. So, and that worries me, because I don't care, well, I care, but I have to cope with the real world, which is here. And that's important. So it strikes me that Europe wants to be a power. We have ambitions. We talk of Eastern policies and Eastern partnerships. We want to have a unified policies over this or that. But in terms of our military, we rely on NATO, and we are absolutely dependent on the United States. That's why I'm saying, this is not that I would love Europe to be dependent on the United States. I would want to be Europe absolutely independent from the United States. So, you know, I would want to be the ambassador of a European country, which could be tough in Washington. I would say, you know, in, say, visa waiver debate, I was frustrated in how weak position I am with my arguments. Because if I was in a different position, I would bang on the table and say, do it. Because if you don't, we are partner to you, and forget about that partnership. We depend on you. I hate that. I want Europe to be more independent, but we are not. And in Libya, this was strikingly visible. We were like that emperor, fancy dressed, but in reality naked. So our ambition, and I hate when we then start, because then people say, okay, but there is a soft power of Europe, and there is European funds. You know what's funny thing? There was a good article in Slovak op-eds yesterday or day before. Yesterday, that in the Marshall Plan to Greece, overall assistance was 2.5% of GDP, and it made a miracle for the Greek economy those days. Today, European assistance, it's more than 100% has been more than 100% of Greek GDP, and they are an absolute mess. So something is wrong here on the European side, and I want Europe to be strong, successful, competitive power in the world, but Libya was to me bad news in that, because we saw Europe stripped down naked. In one little critical note for Europeans, I think Gaddafi wouldn't went so far if he didn't have some kind of internal reassurance that at least 2 big European powers in the close neighborhood would never do that to me. And when I see some of those faces of European leaders who would speak of values and then come and kick his ass, I feel very bad. You know, it gives me bad feeling about Europe. It's a little bit bitter feeling at the end. And I forgot what else I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, let's turn it over for questions from our audience. So do we have any questions anywhere?
I'll try and speak Slovak. I'm politologist Stefanovic. I would like to talk of more profane level, because we're in Slovakia, we're not on diplomatic grounds. Of course, we're saving with our public budget, and European Union has agriculture as its priority, so military is something that we will have to save money on. Nonetheless, I'd like to continue with what Mr. Chmelár said. The intelligence service really played an important role in Afghanistan and elsewhere, so maybe this is the area where we should focus on. And NATO should be, to me, strong. It should be sovereign. Europe should play an important role. However, so far we can only see a lot of hesitation and doubts, and doubts were obvious with Libya, even though Danes and Dutch forces played an important role there. But we can still see a lot of hesitation from all stakeholders in terms of Syria. Syria is really the place where we can see the reality of NATO, and we will wait and see how far and how long will NATO wait until it starts its intervention, military intervention. Kto by sa k tomu chcel vyjadriť? Dobre, tak ešte máme nejakú otázku? I'd like to ask one question. When it comes to Afghanistan, we know that the battle can be won if we do not know the enemy. Did we really know the enemy there? And the next question, didn't NATO underappreciate the ideological dimension of the battles? Could we stand against the ideological of Muslim countries with an ideology which would be adequate? I would like to pose a question which consists of two parts. If we are talking about NATO, we are actually talking about the expanded name of American troops. I believe this is true because for quite some time, it was some time ago when Winston Churchill made a speech at an American university where he announced to the students and to the American president that Great Britain is handing over its role of a protector of Western values to the hands of Americans, because it is the strongest and the most powerful country. So right after that, NATO was established. If we adopt the idea that NATO is only the American army, then in the 20th century, American army had quite a lot of foreign interventions, but to my knowledge, only 3 of them were successful: Western Germany, Japan, and South Korea. These are regions in which Americans managed to bring American values, American economy, American standard of living, and where they really made the difference. And subsequently, there is a question whether with such amount of American missions with relatively low success rate, whether with such invasions it is not decisive to have a broad support of citizens. Because the American army can have a successful invasion and can get rid of the given regime and establish a new one, but it seems like it cannot do anything else. If we take Iraq, Afghanistan, let alone Vietnam. So that's one part of my question. And the second part is related to the first one. So if a current activity of American army seems to be doubtful or controversial, then UN we know it's not efficient enough. There are many reservations to its activities. However, it disposes of military power. So my question is whether it wouldn't be more reasonable to shift or to phase in from NATO to UN structures and its military forces and have UN military forces as a global organization in this globalized world.
All right, well, it's almost 8 o'clock, so I don't want us to go over too long, but I would love to give everybody at least one chance to address any of these issues that they'd like to very briefly. So would somebody like to start? Sure.
Sorry. Syria is a very different situation from the situation that we faced in Libya. In Libya, you had more or less a unified public uprising. In Syria, you had calls, united calls from the Arab League for intervention. You also had agreement at the level of the UN Security Council. One can debate the level of enthusiasm that two members had, and I'm thinking of Russia and China. But in the end, they did join. Let's say they abstained and did not block the resolution. It's unfortunate, in my view, that one of our European allies, also a member of the EU, also chose to abstain. And probably some, or possibly even many in that country, regret that. But in any event, according to the procedures of the UN Security Council, that resolution was passed. So you had an international legitimate mandate. you had a resistance that was led by a fairly unified movement within Libya, and you had very broad support in the Arab world for the intervention. You don't have these ingredients together in Syria. We may regret this, but that's the case. And in fact, you have at least one country, and possibly two in the Security Council, that have warned that they would oppose military intervention there. And at least one of those countries has sold a great deal of arms to the Syrian regime. So the conditions are not the same. How does NATO work in this environment? NATO is an alliance of 28 democracies. They have to decide by consensus, and a number of those democracies insist as an absolute minimum that there be a legitimization by the UN Security Council, and you simply don't have that condition. NATO is not some supranational organization that decides on its own to do something. And the military costs, I'm not saying that they are impossible, but the military questions associated with action in Syria are not trivial. It, of course, has a long border with the NATO ally Turkey. A military operation would require active support from that NATO ally. You don't establish humanitarian corridors and humanitarian passages simply by wishing the Syrian army away. So until there's a consensus that our countries are willing to put at risk, once again, our soldiers, our men and our women, under a UN authorization, I fear that there won't be any direct action to end what is, I admit, a very terrible situation that's going on in Syria. This doesn't mean that we're helpless. There are a number of strong, and I go beyond the diplomatic sanctions, I go to the economic sanctions and other pressures on Syria. But you have a regime that's heavily armed, that's willing to be very brutal to its own population, and that's receiving direct and significant support from its neighbor, Iran. And in a period we've been discussing, I may disagree with a lot of what you've said, for example, about Afghanistan. I won't disagree that there's a great, if you want to call it fatigue, I'll accept the word fatigue, a fatigue with war, a fatigue with the commitment of forces in Afghanistan. No one seems yet to feel that the situation in Syria has reached an insupportable level of barbarity that would require us to use military force.
First, I will comment on this issue you have talked about, which is the role of UN. Today we cannot go back to the role and task of UN that used to be valid here before. But with this due comment, I'd like to emphasize one thing. The crisis, the UN crisis, is not a crisis of its mechanisms, but the crisis of political will. UN has all the mechanisms to solve and tackle the crisis moments in the similar way as NATO does. The criticism of UN is primarily, and as of the beginning of the 90s, is of ideological substance, and it is based on presumptions that are not fair, that UN has never done anything good, etc. The UN had a great deal of credit for Honduras crisis and its solution, the Gulf, etc., and then the many humanitarian actions to Iraq also have been organized through UN. And if we criticize it for excessive bureaucracy, administration, etc. I would just like to give you a couple of numbers. The UN is suspected to be an over-bureaucratized organization, while the total number in all 24 UN agencies, including UNICEF and UNESCO, equals the number of civil servants in Wyoming, the smallest state in the US, and the budget for the Peace Corps is almost equal to the budget of New York Police Department. So if we talk about the incapacities of UN, let's talk primarily about the will of international community to solve things in this way. Syria is such a good example when we see a huge humanitarian catastrophe, but this question is not in the interest of alliance because it has no global connotations. This question is thus scratched because on the global level there is no political will to solve this situation, and naturally it opts for things that it considers to be important from various reasons or from subjective reasons more important. And last but not least, the question of Mr. Káčer outlined a very important or very interesting thing. What would do Slovak participation in the Libya intervention? He made a speculation, like how it would knock down the Slovak army. This is one of the causes why I do criticize the efficiency in management of military operations by alliance. But in order to talk about increasing efficiency, we would need to leave the language of the well-established cliches, such as we need to participate, we need to increase, etc., etc. But we should open also the questions that seem as science fiction at the first sight, such as what NATO needs from us. Is it really our almost totally collapsing army with 3 missiles or with 3 jet aircrafts that are totally redundant from the perspective of defense of our territory? This is what you keep on talking about, and Mr. Ondrejcsák has already mentioned it on one TV debate, and I thought that it was just that he said something he did not want it, but I don't believe that the module of the British colonial is something we should apply in those countries. Hello, to say something like that among Americans who are very sensitive to the issues of colonialism is something that is really bizarre, but that's your problem. I'd like to say one thing when it comes to the army. The Slovak army is, in its current condition, is not able to provide for basic tasks of the defense for this country, and because the involvement of the Slovak army in the NATO and in the system of collective defense is connected to the priorities that are set by NATO. Let's define what NATO needs from us. Specialized units that are used in international missions, but do we need ultrasound aircraft that were said by our Minister of Defense that they are a question of prestige? This consumes most of our budgets for defense, while there are examples such as Slovenia, where Slovenian airspace is protected by Italians. I really don't know why we are so stubborn, and we keep on saying that we need to have our suprasound aircrafts and we need to protect our airspace by ourselves, and why we cannot be more efficient. This is and I'm sorry for saying that, this is a general blabbing that talks about symbols of state. Do you believe that Slovenia is less qualified or inferior state because it doesn't have its suprasound aircrafts?
Wish to be characterized once time as a British colonial officer in terms of military capabilities. So sorry for that. I know that it's quite sensitive, but I mean, doesn't make sense. I wish you to spend just 1 week in a real world, dear colleague. Really, that's all. According to the United Nations, to your questions, to replacement of the NATO's forces by forces of the United Nations, there are two problems. The first problem is that the United Nations doesn't have real military forces. So the military forces of United Nations are how to say it, offered by member states, so it's quite similar to NATO, for example. NATO doesn't have military force, so the only NATO's capability is the EVEX capability, which is a joint capability. Each NATO operation is based on modular system of contributions, similarly to United Nations forces. But the main problem is that the nature of decision-making process within the United Nations. So I can't imagine a serious problem in a strategically important region in the world when the most important permanent members of the Security Council will vote unanimously. We had some very rare exemptions, for example, war in the Persian Gulf in 1991, but there are very, very rare.
Let me get to those questions, but I have to find them.
I'll reply in Slovak if they were all Slovak.
The savings are going on in Europe in Secret Service. I do agree. Is it? Are there savings? Are there budgetary cuts in our defense? The paradox is that when we constructed the first ambitious defense plan for 2010, was set up for a structure of 24,000 people, where there was 20% set aside for the modernization, etc. But in total numbers, we got this amount into the state budget because we did not expect Slovakia to grow by 8% of GDP, but we just threw the money around because we didn't expect a 70% increase in the pensions of military. So Slovakia is a world champion in non-efficient use of its funds and the political reassessment of all projects and all the projects that have been launched as if they were poured into the savage. So we need to really face the facts. And if if my face is front, I don't need to be surprised that I see really front face in the mirror when it comes to the secret services. I do agree. I do agree that, and I believe that today's system needs to be much more creative in taking perspectives on secret service. And when it comes to Secret Service, Slovakia does not use this instrument as it should be used when it comes to global challenges, and maybe it would be good that in international, maybe we are good in international cooperation and sharing some information, but we could do much more and we could use it much more creative way. But any kind of increase of budget needs to be bound to a clear improvement in efficiency. Pouring money into a non-reformed and non-transformed system is just waste of money. When it comes to the Secret Service of US, I believe we have those high illusions. I believe there have been great, huge mistakes done by the US Secret Service, and they try to remedy now, and I would like to bring attention to two things. It's not enough to boost the budget and get the top technology that everything can be covered and eavesdropped. And if I lose the competence to understand what I said and what was written, then it's all in vain. And this was hugely underestimated because the emphasis was put on the technological side, and what was very much underestimated was whether we have a well-defined enemy and whether we do not underestimate the ideological side. Yes, I do agree those were two mistakes, and therefore I don't like using the term whether we won or lost in Afghanistan. This was not the mission, and this was not the mission statement, and this was not the enemy. The definition of the enemy is totally wrong by principle. And when it comes to UN, I believe there was a question that UN has no military power whatsoever. UN has some power that is authorized to it by coalition and enforcement of a specific resolution. So it's up to the will of the states who wants to contribute to such operation or not. I would be really great if UN was such an organization, this umbrella organization, that is able to enforce the international law in cases that if there is a bad dictator, well, we have a resolution, we knock him into the face, and that's it. That would be just so great. But let's do it in that way. I used to work for the government for 16 years, and even if I work for 160 years more, we would never do it. Therefore, my conclusion is that not that we shouldn't be trying, but we shouldn't be trying in such a way that we waste everything and die. You know, those efforts that I want to get somewhere, but I die on the third kilometer, those are really useless. We are on the way, and I would like to get back to the fact, what I said at the beginning, I'm not in love with NATO. If NATO ceased to exist tomorrow, I won't miss it. But I want to have one thing that for sure, that we have something else that is better than NATO. And if we don't have anything like that guaranteed, I want to have NATO, whether it is ideal or not. That's the second thing. But from my perspective and from the perspective of practical guy, NATO is an efficient organization. There is no better alternative. Not that theoretically there could be an option. Yes, theoretically we are trying, we are striving, but until I have a better alternative, I care about NATO.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who have stayed here for this vigorous and timely debate as we approach the Chicago Summit. And I'd like to ask you to join me in a round of applause for our four panelists here. Thank you again. I just want to point out that events like this face-to-face that we organize with our partners, the Open Society Foundation, events like this and others that the Embassy organizes can be found on our Embassy Facebook page. You may have seen the material that was on your seat, so I'd encourage you to check us out. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again.